Hello everyone and welcome to Insights for Leaders. I'm Anna Purchas, London office senior partner at KPMG, and I'll be your host today. I feel like we start every event saying this, but inflation remains a huge issue for consumers and businesses. Last week, the news that inflation in March remained above 10% was widely reported. That could see interest rates go up again, with many commentators predicting the Bank of England will raise them to 5% in an effort to bring inflation under control. That's bad news for consumers who continue to struggle with high energy and food costs and face much higher mortgage payments as they renew. It presents similar challenges to businesses. Many industries are facing reduced demand at the same time that their costs of energy, staff and raw materials are going up. And in most situations, those costs can't be passed on to end customers. The situation isn't helped by ongoing geopolitical uncertainty and supply chain issues, or by a need to invest in digital transformation and ESG. So, where can you spend less and where should you be spending more? How can you reduce cost and increase value? To help me answer those questions, I'm joined as usual by a great lineup of guests. Richard Windsor, analyst and founder of Radio Free Mobile, will provide his insights on the economic and geopolitical situation and what they mean for cost management. And he'll explore how technology can play a critical role. And in the studio with me, we have three of our experts on cost management. Isabel Zisselberger, Head of Customer and Operations, Ed Bolton, partner from our Global Strategy Group, and Ruth Svensson, trained psychologist and partner from our people consulting team with a focus on people and change management. They'll provide practical tips on how you can safely and sustainably take cost out of your business. We were also due to hear from David Butler, CEO of Crew Clothing. Unfortunately, David is unable to join us today. David, we hope all is well, and we'll look for an opportunity for you to join us on a future event. As usual, we'll be asking you to get involved through our poll questions, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session where we'll be answering your questions. So please share them with us in the chat box on the right of your screen. If you aren't familiar with the Spot Me platform, please check the chat box where we'll share top tips on how to get the best out of this event. Right, lots to talk about, so let's get started. And first, let's bring in Richard. Richard has extensive experience in the global technology sector, equities, and his business, Radio Free Mobile, helps its clients understand and evaluate the players in the digital ecosystem. Richard, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Anna.
It would be great to start by getting your views on the economic outlook and what that means for organisations looking to reduce costs.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Well, that's a very big question, and from a very high level, which as a technology specialist, I look at the macro economy. There's bad news and there's some good news. So firstly, the bad news is prevalent everywhere. Inflation remains really quite elevated, and the problem with that is that if you look at much of the technology sector, what's happened is that split the sector very much into two pieces. The consumer-facing end of the technology sector is really struggling with growth because consumers are tightening their belts. And that is why when you look at the likes of Google and Meta and even Apple, you are seeing a reduced or an increased focus on cost in order to deal with the lower demand about which they can't do an enormous amount at the moment. On the enterprise side, it's a completely different kettle of fish. If you look at Microsoft's numbers just last night, for example, better than expected numbers as enterprise spending on productivity tools remains stronger than expected. So it's proving to be a little bit more resilient. And that's kind of how it looks on the technology sector. Looking out, perhaps into 2024, I see a slightly better scenario, which is just on a very high level. I'm expecting that the inflation will start to come down round about the middle of 2024. By that time, we will have dealt with or suffered an enormous amount of inflation, which, if you look at it from an inflation being a cost point of view, you could argue at that point we will have paid the price for the pandemic. And at that point, you could see inflation start to come down, and then growth could start to get a little bit better as interest rates can come back down and financing and debt and credit markets return to some degree of normality. So in summary, it's a bit tough at the moment, but I think there are some signs that things could get a little bit better towards the middle of next year.
Thank you. And are there any sectors where there's a significant potential for driving value by reducing costs?
Yes, this is something that we called out quite some months ago. And it's a subsector of technology, and it's particularly social media, a little bit within the search industry. And this really was set the precedent by Twitter under Elon Musk, where he has cut more than half of the workforce, and the service is still functioning. Now, yes, it's not quite as robust as it used to be. It's not quite as stable. Some people are saying that there's a lack of innovation in Twitter now. Although, to be honest with you, I've looked at Twitter for 10 years and there hasn't really been much innovation over the last 10 years in the Twitter service itself. So when you then take that and you roll that across all of the other social media companies, say Meta Platforms or Snap, or even to a lesser degree, Google, what you can see is a very substantial potential to reduce costs because they basically grew too much. They took on a load of staff that they don't need. And the story on Meta Platforms, and if you look at the share price, you'll see that it's doubled so far this year, has all been one of cost cutting. One slight outlier there is Amazon. Amazon certainly has scope to cut costs, has done so already, and probably will continue to do so going forward. And this largely is because in 2021, Amazon became of the opinion that the e-commerce party was never going to end. And as a result of that, they built out their last mile distribution and their warehousing probably a little bit too much. And that's what you're seeing them cutting back on right now. So yes, particularly social media, certainly in technology, is one place where there is still substantial scope for further cost cuts.
Fantastic. I'm sure we'll come back to that point with my guests in the studio later. But staying with you, many of the economic challenges we're facing are a result of the geopolitical situation we said at the start, with the Ukraine crisis and the tension between China and the US having a huge impact. How are these ongoing geopolitical challenges impacting the ability of businesses to manage costs in their supply chains?
Well, Anna, it's making life extremely difficult. If you look, but again, particularly on technology, but also if you look at many other industries, particularly those industries that make things, China has been for many years now the factory of the world. And what is happening is a substantial decoupling. If you look at the geopolitical situation, and again, I'm quoting from my business partner, Mr. Alistair Newton, who writes the geopolitical stuff with me, what has started as a strategic rivalry has actually become an ideological struggle. If you look at the United States, what it is effectively doing through the limitation of semiconductors is waging all-out technological war on China. And, recent regulatory changes have substantially hardened the position against China, such that if you look at it in real terms, China is unlikely to ever really develop to become a force in semiconductors. And the situation as far as China's manufacture of semiconductors may even get worse from here. Now, what that has led to is China saying to itself, we can't repeat this anywhere, and so we're going to do all of our own standards. And as a result of that, also the difficulty in the situation and the increasing regulation is meaning that people are leaving China. Now, this is not a quick process. If you're looking for a quick cost cut, leaving China is probably not one of them. The way it's basically being done is, take Qualcomm, for an example. Qualcomm is a semiconductor manufacturer, and they do part of the assembly in China. Now, their position is effectively, we want to diversify away from China, but what will happen is that when our current capacity when we reach current capacity on our current installation, instead of building another one next to it, we're going to do it somewhere else. And you see this in Apple as well. Of all the American technology companies, I would say Apple is probably in the most precarious situation. But even Apple is being forced to substantially diversify away from China. And that's what we're going to continue to see. I think there is no end in sight. And so this steady but slow decoupling causes an awful lot of problems. And unfortunately, it probably means costs in the short term are going to rise, which will increase further the pressure for companies to seek cost cuts and cost savings elsewhere.
Thank you. One final question for you, Richard. Everyone's been talking about generative AI and the risks and opportunities. What's your view from a cost perspective? How can organisations use generative AI to help reduce costs and increase value, or is it just hype?
That's another great question, Anna. So in short, there's an awful lot of hype, but there is some reality too. The hype effectively is we have reached artificial general intelligence. What that means to the layman is that machines become very intelligent, and this is the kind of doomsday Skynet robots taking over the world scenario. We're nowhere near that. Quite simply because if you look at the limitations of artificial intelligence that have plagued it since 1986, they're all still prevalent today. What you have got is a substantial increase in the ability of AI to do certain tasks, particularly around language. Now, that, in our view, has two substantial implications, particularly for the enterprise, which is these systems could be used to make enterprise data much easier to access, much easier to catalog, and frankly, much easier to research when you're looking for data within your company. Now, companies can approach this in two ways. One, I keep my existing cost base the same, and I make my employees more productive through the use of this new technology. Or what I do is, but don't forget, that would require increased revenues, which in some cases is going to be tricky because of the macro outlook. The second scope is, well, I can do the same, but I can do it with less people. So I implement that technology, and the people I do have left become much more productive. And in that scope, there is substantial potential for increase in productivity from the use of particularly these large language models, which allow you to converse very freely and openly with an artificial intelligence system.
Thanks, Richard. Super interesting. Richard will be back for our Q&A, so please do share any questions you have for him in our chat bar on the right of the screen. Now, let's have our first poll question. So we'd like to ask you, thinking about your business, are you running or planning to run a programme to reduce costs? Yes, you've started. Yes, planning to start this year, or no. We'll take a look at your responses later. Okay, let's bring in our other three guests who are with us in the studio today. Hi, Izzy, Ed, and Ruth. First question, we were talking earlier, and I think we've all had conversations with our clients who are struggling with costs at the moment. So Ed, let me come to you first. Why do companies find this so hard?
I guess the glib answer is because it's really difficult to do, because you're trying to balance many things in the equation. You've got the short-term, long-term element to this, which Richard sort of referred to there. But I pull it down to four core reasons I think that I've seen generally, the time I've been working with organisations on this. Firstly, it's where the number one mistake tends to be not aligning it to strategy. Mm-hmm. So think short term, potentially take some quite short term actions which may not be sustainable, cut the recruitment, stop training, those sorts of things which won't last. But then secondly, and probably even worse, is where organisations don't think around where they're trying to take themselves in the longer term and cut the costs that they need for their future growth. Really what you're trying to do when you're looking at cost programmes, which for us is normally where you want to make a relatively significant change to the cost base. What you're trying to do is set yourself up for a platform for growth when you do this well. So that's number one reason, the alignment to strategy. Number two reason for me is around not taking the right approach and not getting the right fact base. So the fact base is really important when you look at this. It has to be a very fact-based conversation that you need to have. And typically you need to pull information from many different internal systems and then draw some external insights so that you can look at how things could be different and really consider and provoke that. And that's actually quite difficult to do, and you need to do that quickly. And that's where organisations start to struggle. The third thing, and before Ruth panics, I won't steal her thunder, because she'll talk about this much more eloquently than I ever would, but it's really around the change management impact and the impact of leadership. I mean, Ruth often describes it as one of the moments of truth in an organisation, particularly when you've got to start thinking about roles. So that's really important about how you manage people through the change and, again, reset the organisation so that you can grow again afterwards if you have had to do something with roles in an organisation. And then lastly, it can become too theoretical and people can get caught up in the data and think about the ideas and not think enough about what it's going to take to implement. So pace really is your friend in these things, and that means that you've got to work in parallel, looking at both what you're going to change and how you're going to change it. So those are my big four, really. Align it to strategy, get the right approach and fact base, over-invest in the way you manage the change for the people, and think back from what it takes to implement.
For great reasons to kick us off there. Thank you. So Ruth, let's come to you and get your views. What are the challenges from a people perspective?
I think you have to look at the psychology of it. So people don't like change, right? Transformation in itself is something that's a bit scary because it leaves a level of uncertainty. You don't have complete control maybe over your future. As soon as you put cost into that equation, and it's a cost transformation, people jump to headcount reduction, which suddenly means, oh my goodness, my job might be at risk. So what this leads to is essentially an organisation where people are feeling scared. This means that their behaviours become about protecting themselves. You know, our brain was built for survival, and essentially if you're feeling scared and your threat response is elevated, you start protecting yourself, which means that a lot of the behaviours that you see in high-performing organisations start to decrease. So things like collaboration, things like innovation. It's therefore really important, as Ed says, that journey that you take people on, and where you can, giving them some sense of certainty and optimism about the future is taken very seriously, and people are handheld through that transformation.
Love that point about optimism for the future. Super important. We've got our poll results in. So let's take a look at what our audience said. We asked, are you running or planning to run a programme to reduce costs? 52% saying yes, they have started. So this is a super topical conversation we're having right now. Those results say that. 19% say yes, planning to start this year. 29% saying no. Izzy, let's bring you in. What do you make of those results?
Well, I think it's interesting. It sort of confirms why we're here today, right? Which is that from all the conversations that we're having, a lot of our clients are looking at cost. And of course, organisations always are very cost aware. Mm-hmm. But because of all the pressures, as Richard spoke about, as we all know, the cost pressure has gone up, the margin compression, challenges around growth. This makes perfect sense to us. I mean, that is exactly why we're here. And if it was easy, well, then we wouldn't be here. But This is exactly what we are talking to clients about. It depends very much on their situation, where they are in terms of the maturity, how long they've been doing this. But I think what we're seeing for the first time is a number of organisations facing into this who haven't traditionally had to look at cost quite so closely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what makes it tough.
Thank you. Ed, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, to re-emphasise the point around the different sectors, I mean, and again, it links back to Richard's point around the technology sector. You know, you think about the growth those organisations have seen over the last decade or so. This is really the first time where they've had to go there. Other than that, I think I'm absolutely with Izzy. I see those numbers, and it sort of reflects the volume of client and emphasis of client conversations over the last 6 months or so. Yeah, in terms of where their priorities, unsurprisingly, are going. And again, I think it's also encouraging. Most client conversations I have do start with we know we need to do something on cost, but we need to do this sustainably, and we need to do this in the right way to put growth into our organisation, do the right things by our people.
Yeah, absolutely. Izzy, let me come back to you. So for organisations that are putting in place a cost programme, which areas offer the best potential for reducing costs?
It's a great question.
I'm glad you got that one.
And I'm going to give everyone's consultant's favourite answer, which is it depends. But it really does, because it depends on the level of maturity, as we said, the level of market pressure that they're under to demonstrate results to their stakeholders, and also the organisation itself and what they're doing. But there's a couple of areas to call out. I mean, we've touched on staff cost. I mean, obviously, in many organisations, the staff cost is significant. That doesn't necessarily mean headcount reduction immediately. There's a lot of other levers that we can pull. Real estate, energy costs, anyone that has a complex supply chain, there's going to be opportunities to look at. Likewise with your operating model and your sort of locational footprint. But we also increasingly look at more niche areas, such as the legal entity constructs or working capital, debt management, tax, for example. These are all different cost levers that we tend to analyse when we're helping clients figure out where's the best place to look.
Thank you. Any comments from either of you?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a whole range of cost levers you can look at. I think the best programmes are those that look broad to start with and then rapidly prioritise. So for me, it is about getting a sense of where the opportunities might be from the organisation. We often do it on a hypothesis basis. So where have we seen opportunities before? And then using really robust analysis to get forward to, what's the right portfolio for this organisation, given where they are and all the context that Isabel talked about.
And a large part of that robust analysis that when we work with Ed's team is focusing on the impacts. So in terms of helping organisations choose which areas they prioritise, to really think through the impacts of what they're implementing, how is that going to affect their people, and how difficult will it be to take them on that journey with them. So doing full impact assessments is essential.
That's key, got it. And thinking about how you go about it. When we're talking about taking costs out in the past, best practice was zero-based budgeting, cost management. Is that still the case? What does best practice look like today?
So I think zero basing still, the principles of zero basing are really strong, and I think they still have if I brought it right back, you think about zero basing essentially asking two questions. What do I need to do? So I strip the organisation back to what I definitely need to do to deliver my strategy, deliver my results, and how do I do it? So that's really valuable. Those principles are really valuable. What I think we've seen increasingly over the last probably 5 years is it's become more of a part of a cost programme rather than the overall approach to the cost programme. So it's taking the right tools out for different areas of the cost base. So a good example, have been working with an larger engineering organisation, and they've got a significant project management function that when you did the scan across the initial diagnostic, no one quite knew what people were doing in that function. It wasn't always clear what the purpose of it was. So did a really deep dive on that from a zero basing perspective, whereas we used other approaches in other areas. So it's looking at different areas of the cost base in slightly different ways, Anna. The other ways that we look at things are we'll often start that scan by almost looking at an organisation as though we were working with a buyer, because it's a really interesting mindset. What would someone else do to this organisation if they were needing to drive synergies out, efficiencies out to fund a deal? That's a really good way to change your own mindset when you're looking at your organisation. Similarly as well, what we're increasingly finding, we're doing this with one of the retailers at the moment, looking at cost more on an end-to-end basis. So rather than looking at it on a functional basis, really trying to look at the key cost drivers across the organisation and work out what the impact is across the piece. So to avoid what we've often called before squeezing the balloon, so take costs at one point and it just squeezes up somewhere else.
I'm sure we've all seen that. Yeah. So a more sophisticated approach, and that looking at what might happen if you go through a transaction. I've seen that with the PE house approach. What would they do in this situation? Thanks, Ed. Ruth, let's come back to you. What should our listeners be considering from a people and change perspective?
The how you do it is really important. So back to the point that you've got lots of people in your organisation. They're all going to be potentially worrying about it. I think it's very easy to focus on the cost component without thinking about what is the future of our business. And actually, quite often when we do cost transformation, it is about value. So it's kind of not all negative. It's about looking to the future and seeing how we redirect investment into more exciting and interesting things to take our organisation forward in the way that we need to. We typically have, I guess, I would love to only have 3 areas. I've got 5 areas, which is probably too many, but I just think all of them are really important. So bear with me, I'll be brief. The first area, we talked about the narrative, really, really important, really key that you have a very systematic communication and engagement plan, the emphasis being on engagement of your people and explaining to them what's happening, trying to give them some certainty, trying to show them that the future is bright, etc. The second area is about retention and having a good retention strategy. In times of change, if people feel like they're potentially part of a sinking ship, your good people will leave. So it's really important you understand where they all are, and ideally at the right point you involve them in the programme so they're part of shaping the future. The third area relates to measuring, so measurement, the soft stuff and the hard stuff. We talked a bit about impact assessments and being really crystal clear about what you're doing and how it is impacting on your organisation and putting in place activity to make sure that the impact isn't negative. There's also the soft stuff, so actually understanding sentiment, understanding how people are feeling, and as leaders leaning into those feelings, sometimes negative, and making sure you tackle them. The fourth area is building the change muscle. So making sure you have the capability as a business to actually transform, and your people have that capability too. It's not just external people coming in and doing it to you, because otherwise it will not be sustained, and making sure you also have the skills for some of the interventions. So if you're implementing a new system, make sure your people are properly trained at it. So often we get brought in because people aren't doing what they're meant to be doing around the skills piece, and actually it's just they were never properly trained in it. And finally, make sure all of your people processes are aligned. If you have any contradictions in your people processes, so the way that you performance manage your people, the way that you articulate in job descriptions what's important, people won't change. You have to have everything sort of pushing you in the right direction.
Fantastic. And Izzy, do you have any tips to share? What approaches have you seen that have worked in different sectors or functions?
So honestly, I couldn't agree more with everything that Ruth has just run through, because many of our clients will only go through this maybe once or twice in their lifetimes, right? These sort of big cost takeout programs. And it's such an emotional journey for many. So focusing on all of the people side of things is absolutely critical. There's a couple of other things. I mean, one is just on leadership, right, which we touched on, but the importance of bringing everyone along. What we find most of the time is that leadership sort of agree, yes, we absolutely have to do something, but it's the next level down discussion that gets difficult when it's stopping something that's close to your heart or an initiative that you've started. It's those tough decisions. So it's really It's taking the hypotheses, but then translating that into meaningful actions. What does that mean? And then what's the impact of those? I think, as Ed said, linking it back to your strategy and where you want to end up with is really important. And then doing it quite quickly. So ripping the plaster off, because if we, being thoughtful around what we can achieve, but then working through it at a pace and not getting lost in the numbers and over-analysing and doing often a lot of benchmarking, right, that sort of will just reconfirm what you know that you already have to do. So once you've identified your actions and you've set your targets, just working through those.
The pace component is really key, and it's something regularly when we're working with clients, trying to help them focus on that, because also from a celebrating successes perspective, making sure there's positive momentum, you want to be able to demonstrate, savings and opportunities early.
Yeah, absolutely. So some great tips there. And that pace point, also relevant, as you were saying earlier, Ruth, if you have got headcount reduction, you don't want to keep people hanging around. That's a very uncomfortable situation, obviously, for them and for leaders too. Okay, so now let me give the three of you a break and ask our audience another question. Here we go. How much are you looking to reduce your costs by? Is it less than 5%, 5 to 10%, 11 to 20%, or more than 20%? We're interested to see what response we get to that one. And whilst we wait for those responses, I have a question back to you, Ruth. Now, no matter what the size of the change programme, leaders have a huge role to play in its success. So what should the business leaders in our audience be doing to make sure their cost programmes hit their targets?
So the targets point is interesting because targets are essential. We all need to know where we're going. In my opinion, often leaders are quite good at focusing on the targets, and maybe some of the other areas that are more challenging is there's sort of softer, ill-defined stuff. I spoke before about the fact that when people are feeling, threatened, they don't know kind of where the future of the organisation is going, their threat response is elevated. The way you need to address that, and all the research shows it again and again, is by creating a psychologically safe environment. Now, leaders play the most critical role around doing that. So what's interesting is when there is a cost pressure, often we see leaders revert to quite kind of directive behaviours, really wanting to drive accountability, all very important. But ultimately, your people need to feel compassion. They need to feel that you care about them. They need a sense that, you're listening to them empathetically and you care about their sort of personal story and how this is impacting on them. So actually that sort of psychological safety and the role leaders play in doing that is really critical. I think in terms of the other area, again, it's the leading from the front, the narrative. And again, I understand that, cost transformation can be very stressful, but the thing is organisations often don't have a choice. And actually, there's a real opportunity for them to reinvent themselves in a way that's really positive if they get the narrative and the messaging right. So I think leaders taking that role of showing that the future is bright is really important. And then the final area, which isn't easy, and it's all about personality and historical stuff that's gone on between leadership teams, is about leadership alignment. I feel so strongly when I work with an organisation, I just wish that they could spend as much time as possible getting aligned themselves, having the difficult conversations with each other, challenging each other on their thinking to make sure that they're going out with a united front. Because if they are not united, people aren't stupid, they'll see it. And they'll go, well, if he doesn't believe it or she doesn't believe it, there's no way that I'm following. And actually then it makes the implementation of these transformations so much more complicated, time-consuming and slower. And it's obviously not just at that level in terms of leadership, but that the people driving it from the top set the tone for the rest of the organisation.
That's super. Sorry,
it sounds so basic, doesn't it? But time and time again, this is where it falls over, because it's so easy for leaders to agree at an overall level, and then when it comes to it, right, we have examples to say, well, actually, our business division, we could move a bit slower because we've been doing really well. These guys should do a bit more over here, and that's when you start to see some of those tensions coming through. So, yeah, easier said than done.
I think the other, just a really small point also is in terms of how you articulate what you're doing with the savings. Now, obviously, a large part of it is actually savings on cost, but often there is a reinvestment component. And organisations that do this really well and leaders that do this really well is they're able to articulate the kind of reinvestment framework or the reinvestment approach into exciting projects, or potential acquisitions or new products that you're able to do as a consequence of all your hard work saving the money.
Fantastic. I know we'll come back to the topic of leadership, some great points there, but we've got the poll results in, so let's have a look. So we asked, how much are you looking to reduce your costs by? You said less than 5%, 23%. Most popular answer by some way, 51% saying 5 to 10%, 17% of you saying looking to reduce by 11 to 20%, and 9% going for the big one, more than 20%. So Izzy, Ed, can I get your thoughts on those results? Is that in line with what you're seeing?
So, yeah, I mean, I guess we're having more advanced conversations with clients, involved with clients. They're probably more towards the upper end of those areas, probably above 10%. However, yeah, I think this is in line with a couple of polls I've read over the last week. I think I've seen somewhere, and I forget the source of it now, but it was sort of 7 or 8% numbers were coming out quite consistently. The thing it does prompt me to think about though is, particularly given the economic uncertainty at the moment, I would always be targeting something over what I needed. And I think, I remember during the, probably ages me dreadfully, but doing this during the financial crisis, and someone saying that, one of the retailers saying they'd developed what they thought was their worst case scenario and worked out what they'd do for their worst case scenario. So they sort of called it their break glass option. After 6 months, they'd broken the glass, got that out, and they had to develop another one that they needed to lock again behind the cabinet in case they needed it. So it is, I think, particularly in these times we've got economic uncertainty, you need to probably over-target at this moment. Doesn't mean you have to do everything at once, but you need to know what your options are as you go through.
Yeah. No, agreed. I think it is probably very much in line with what we're expecting. Once you get into the space of doing 11 to 20% or even 20% plus, the number of different cost levers that you need to pull increases exponentially. So most organisations in the 5 to 10% range, I say easy loosely, there's probably about 4 or 5 cost levers you need to pull to achieve that. Once you get into the 20% space, it becomes, 7, 8, up to 10 different initiatives that will have to work in tandem. So it becomes a much more complex undertaking. And especially those organisations that are really mature, they've been doing this for many years, they've probably done all the easy things already. For them, this is going to be much harder. And they're going to have to be much more thoughtful around where this is going to come from, and then for it to be sustained over time as well, right? Because as we said, the balloon or whack-a-mole or whatever we like to call it will just come back otherwise.
It'll come back, right. Okay, thank you. So we've talked a lot about reducing costs, but there is another side to this, isn't there? And that's increasing value. Izzy, let's stay with you. How can organisations find a balance between taking cost out while investing to drive growth?
And actually, Ruth already mentioned this as well, right? Because to us, cost is just a subset of value. It's all part of your enterprise performance. And it very much goes hand in hand, as Ed said, with your strategic direction. We don't have to assume that cost out is always reducing cash in general. It could be used for reinvestment. And actually, some of the best clients that we've worked with have used their cost takeout programs to reinvest in some of the initiatives that they really wanted to do. There was one, this was a banking client that we worked with. They managed to take around 20% out of their operating model and reinvested all of it into the digitization of 10 client journeys, something which they hadn't done up until that point. And it was great for them because it was a huge achievement on the cost side, but also allowed them to move into spaces that they hadn't done before. For them as a business was great, good client benefits that came from that. So we absolutely look at both together, and reinvesting or looking at the sort of wider strategic context makes a lot of sense.
And there's another dimension on this I'd like to explore, and that's how do you manage the apparent conflict between short-term and longer-term objectives here? Ed, what are your views on that?
Well, I'll probably take this right back to where we started on the first two elements. I mean, I think the first question is making sure that you align the objectives and the way you think about the programme with your strategy. So, if a critical part of your strategy, to use a very current example, is to digitise or to really embed ESG into the way you think about your business, then that becomes a priority in terms of where you invest your cost base. And it's a good idea to think about your cost base as an investment. And then the second element is, as you start to drive down into what the individual opportunities are, there's partly to what Ruth said earlier, having that impact assessment. So what are the unintended consequences of some of the changes that you might make, and really thinking through that from different lenses, so that when it comes to the leadership team having to make the choices and trade-offs, because they've never been an easy choice and trade-off, this is always a very difficult set of decisions for any leadership team to make. They've got the full set of facts about the potential impacts and trade-offs that they're making, so they can get to the right portfolio for all their business and understand where the risks are within that.
Thanks, Ed. Now, we heard from Richard earlier on the role of generative AI to reduce costs and increase value. Izzy, what's your take on the role of technology?
I, like many, have been observing all the trends around generative AI, and it continues to amaze me. But what's really interesting is the applications that we're starting to see where clients are actually integrating this into their processes, or fintechs are integrating it into their solutions. I mean, technology isn't the only lever that you can pull in a cost program, but it does play a huge part. There's no doubt about it. And whether it's cloud enablement or having the data to really sort of speed up what you're doing around cost, or speed up some of your growth initiatives, that investment in technology, the technology capabilities that we need for the future, it's going to be a huge element of what organizations have to do. So likewise for workflow enablement. Some of the easiest ways to take cost out quickly is to use workflow enablement solutions, and just to streamline handoffs between teams, as we said, like looking across the whole enterprise and releasing trapped values. So there's a balance here, right? Because some of these larger cost transformations, like a big cloud migration, it's going to take time, it's going to cost money. We don't always have the time or the patience for some of this. So getting the right balance between what can we do quickly versus what do we invest in, but will give us longer term benefits over time. That's part of this upfront assessment that needs to be done fairly quickly around all the hypotheses and how we make this work.
I love that workflow point. That really improves your employee experience as well. Great. Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. Let's bring Richard back on now, because it's time to answer your questions in our Q&A. Thank you for that. And we're going to stick with tech, because I can see we have a question here for Richard. Last year, the big tech trend was the metaverse. It was. What happened to that? Has the focus on cost knocked it into the weeds?
That's always a very interesting question. And actually, the metaverse is a great example of the difference between hype and reality. So if you actually look at the metaverse where it is today compared to where everybody said it was going to be a year ago, it's pretty much exactly where it was. The problem is that all the excitement has kind of disappeared, largely because the pressures from the stock market crushed the valuations of all the fledgling metaverse companies, and everybody kind of lost hope. Now, the interesting thing is that a lot of the stocks, if you like, or the themes is around the consumer metaverse. But actually, the real action right now, and I think for the next few years, is going to be the enterprise metaverse, which is how do I use a virtual 3D environment in my company? And there are some very good examples of this and how you can really improve productivity and perhaps even reduce costs. So, for example, if you make something, or you have a large installation or a factory that you're planning, Making a digital twin of that factory allows you to avoid a lot of the design mistakes. It allows you to plan for circumstances that you could never have foresawn or even modeled, like a massive fire or a flood. And so from that perspective, that's what I expect to see next 3 or 4 years. The metaverse actually in the enterprise, this is where the action is. And, you know, there are a lot of benefits to be had. Now, it's more on the productivity side. In terms of investing for growth, but also, you know, if you're designing something new, investing a little bit now in the enterprise metaverse to get it right first time could save you a fortune in a fairly short order of time.
Fantastic. I'm going to stay with you, Richard. We've got a question about Brexit, so hold in there. As we look to the future, do the speakers see any areas where Brexit can provide real, as opposed to spurious or minimal long-term benefits? Richard, what do you think?
That's a great question. The short answer is potentially. If you look at technology development in the United States versus technology development in Europe, you could make an argument that technology thrives in an environment with lower touch regulation. You know, that's certainly one argument that some people put forward as to why technology is struggling in Europe. Now, assuming that Brexit could deliver a lower touch regulatory environment, potentially that might be quite good for the development of the technology sector over the medium term. However, I fully admit that is an awful lot of ifs.
It is, thank you. I'm going to move us on now to a great question around customer. So perhaps to my colleagues with me in the studio, how do you prevent cost cutting affecting your customers, either directly by affecting the customer experience or indirectly because problems in operations delay or worsen products or service? What do you think?
I can kick us off here because we do advise a lot of our clients around client experience as well. This is a great example of what we said around looking at the hypotheses that you've identified and then assessing the impact of what you're doing. There has been a trend for organisations to look at client journeys and take that all the way through to operations so that you can assess what the impact is going to be. But I'd also like to give a sort of flip side example because there's a tipping point at which investing in client experience is not going to give you any better financial return. And you have to find that point because there is a lot of organisations that over-deliver for the profitability of what they get back from their clients. So I think, first of all, doing a good assessment of your profitable client segments and then thinking about, well, what does that mean in terms of level of service? And we've recently worked with an organisation where we brought in that tiering and we said, absolutely, client experience is important to us, but for some of our less profitable clients, we shouldn't be providing all of this, or if they want it, they have to pay some additional top up or something like that. So balance to be struck, but yeah, any?
No, exactly. I mean, I think it comes back to one of the points you made earlier. One of the ways you can think around that is, you know, using some of the zero basing principles and thinking about different service levels in a very structured way. Yeah, if I'm going to spend this much, what do I get? And then testing that with customers in terms of what are the bits that they really value. And then you can find out whether there are any disproportionately expensive activities that customers actually aren't valuing. So it is about getting better understanding of both that, what the customer really wants and the cost to provide, and moulding those two bits of data that aren't often brought together in that way in many organisations.
Thanks, Ed and Izzy. Ruth, I'm going to come to you. So we've got several people-related questions. First up, how can we make sure that a cost transformation doesn't undermine our employee value proposition?
Yeah, I mean, I feel a bit like a broken record on the kind of narrative point, but it is just so important. I think there is something about thinking through what is the organisation of the future for you? What does it look like and what does that mean for your employees? Now, I think from an employee value proposition perspective, there's lots of things that make up an employee value proposition, and it's how they feel they're treated every day they come to work. It's every interaction they have with their people processes, their performance management, their learning and development, etc. So what I would say is, if your organisation is feeling stressed at the time, and your sentiment analysis has given you clues that people really are finding the situation difficult, you need to lean into that difficulty and you need to work harder on things that are important to your employees. It's really that simple.
So that's the leaders, the HR team working together.
And making sure you're giving them something of what's in it for me, and trying to articulate how the transformation actually does have benefits for them. So the skills piece is often an area where organisations will heavily invest during cost transformation. Again, if you've identified people that are your talent, actually helping them think about how them playing a leading role in the transformation is actually an amazing CV point. You know, it's something that if they're heavily involved in leading. So it's just trying to think through what are all of the things we can do to make this as positive experience as possible.
Ruth, I think the other thing, just in my experience, has been, where unfortunately you do have to make people redundant, those that are staying with the organisation will look at the way you treat people.
They really will.
That are leaving. It's sort of a moment of, how true are you to your values? I think most people accept, unfortunately at times organisations have to make changes that involves role changes, but it's really important to the way they feel about their emotional attachment to the organisation, how you treat people that are leaving the organisation. So you really need to think that through carefully. So it really comes, so it's done in the right way and in line with the way that your organisation acts.
Yeah, and some companies go so far as to helping employees find other jobs, for example. So I think it's just that compassion, that nurturing, and leaning into the human stuff.
And sometimes you don't want people to leave. So
No.
Retention, thinking there. So you said involving people in the change. Yes, I've seen that. Super powerful. Any other top tips to help retain the talent you really want to keep?
Well, the first thing is, I think, make sure before you embark on these journeys, you actually know where your talent are, because having that data is very, very helpful. And then, yes, it's about involving them. It's about making sure that there are opportunities in terms of their career paths. It's about making sure that you are investing, as mentioned, in things like skills and learning for them. And thinking how they can get the most out of the organisation while they're there, and just really being empathetic to their situation and considering it.
Thank you. Richard, I'm going to come back to you for a question. It's a great one. What's the long-term impact of the balkanisation of tech between China and the US?
Another good question. This is bad news long term for the technology sector, and I suspect many other sectors that that rely on globalization. If you take the internet as an example, effectively what's going on right now is a balkanization of the internet. The internet is being split into two different pieces. Now, the thing is that what makes the internet so valuable is that anybody with a connected device of any description can get access to it and communicate with anybody else. What you're talking about here is with China going down the road of we're going to do our own standards for everything, means that in the future, say virtual reality or augmented reality or autonomous driving or even the 6G mobile network, there will be incompatibility. A Western device won't work in China and vice versa. And what that does is it splits the network into two smaller networks. Now, the value of a network is exponentially related to the number of devices that are attached to it, which is called Metcalfe's law of networking. Now, that means when you take one big network and split it into two, the actual value creation is orders of magnitude less than it was before. Now this is a very long-term issue, 20 years in the making, but the seeds of it are being sown now. And what it means is that overall the long-term growth for technology and the outlook for globalization is going to be lower if the world's second largest economy completely isolates it from everybody else. Now, in order to prevent that from happening, some form of geopolitical thaw needs to happen, and there's no sign of that yet.
Indeed, no sign of that yet. Just staying with you, Richard, Izzy mentioned workflow. In your view, which technologies should I be investing in and which should I put on hold if I'm managing a big cost programme?
Yeah, it's quite clear where everybody is investing and where the benefits are to be had. And that at the moment is enterprise-based software. Certainly, if you're feeling brave, have a look at large language models. But it's going to take you a long time to do the implementation. I mean, there aren't any real products properly available yet that I would classify as enterprise grade. But if you look through the, there are plenty of other options out there for enterprise software. Microsoft's put up good numbers. Palantir continues to grow and does have a really good product, and people could generate a lot of value from it. The flip side of that is probably consumer. If you're a consumer-facing company, you're just going to have to tighten your belt and see your way through it. And so if that means putting off or delaying a new revision of your software or slowing down the release of your next product in order to keep the cost base in line with a lower revenue outlook, that's something you're just going to have to deal with.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to come back to my guests in the studio here, probably Ed, I think this one's for you. How can a business assess the ROI of cost-cutting initiatives to ensure they deliver long-term value?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to being really robust at the beginning where the benefits are going to get delivered from. And I think just to build on the theme of technology, that's a particular hobby horse of mine with any technology change. How are we actually going to monetize that? How's it going to get delivered? Where are we going to see that money in the P&L? So I think it's the upfront analysis. And then I think it's really focusing on the approach to benefits realisation. So how do you embed that? Those promises within budgets, how do you track that? How do you make sure that money hits the bottom line and that you can prove that it's hitting the bottom line? So I think it's quite a simple thing to conceptualise, quite difficult to do in practice just with everything else moving around, but it's really about identifying where the majority of the value is going to come from, what are the key performance indicators that will show you, both leading and lagging indicators, that will show you you're on track or you have achieved, and keeping a really rigorous focus on those for the duration of your implementation.
And maybe just to add on what Ed was saying, right, measuring it, this is a potential industry and rabbit hole that organisations can go down, is trying to measure everything. I think there's an 80-20 rule here. So having a couple of key metrics, measuring them very frequently so that you can also make adjustments. So as you see that things are perhaps not on track, you can slow down the investment that you're releasing to certain initiatives, or you can make adjustments quickly, but not turning it into an industry in itself.
I completely get that. I think we've got time for one more question, unless your answers are super short. This is an interesting one. Do you feel as if we are slowly losing a sense of trust and identity through increasing use of digital communication? Obviously, an overhang from what how we all changed the way we work through COVID.
What we've seen recently in some of the stress in the banking system is that the digital communications, it goes very fast. I think organisations need to make sure that they're equipped for that they have the right capabilities from an external management perspective so that they can handle some of that messaging as it arises, because it's quite different to what we've seen in the past.
Okay, so thanks for all your questions. I'm afraid we're out of time today, but I want to wrap up by going back to Izzy, Ed and Ruth for their key takeaways. So Izzy, let's start with you. What's the one thing our audience should take away about reducing cost and increasing value?
Can I have two things?
Yeah. As long as they're very quick.
I think the pace, so yeah, doing it quickly, so not getting lost in all of the detail, and then making it very, very practical and breaking it down into implementable steps.
Ed?
As you would expect me to say, align it with your strategy and make sure it's sustainable.
Ruth?
And as you would expect me to say, leadership, lean in, know the shadow you cast.
Fantastic. Well, it just remains for me to say a big thank you to our guests today, Richard, Izzy, Ruth and Ed. Please visit the resources tab for all our latest insights, content and events. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back on the 17th of May when we'll be talking tech. We hope to see you then. Thank you.